Well, good afternoon. I'm Darren Davis, and it's my great honor to serve Baylor as director of the Institute for Faith and Learning and also as vice president for University Mission. And I want to welcome you all. First, let you know of our gratitude for your presence. We have a great crowd today. One of the reasons I think a lot of you came was we devised a very innovative marketing tool for this particular lecture. If you received the email blast about Dean Hibbs' lecture and received it on a PC computer, you were not able to read the message, but you got a giant size picture of his left eyeball and at least part of his eyebrow.
So these are all Mac users.
That Welcome to the 2017 Bill and Roberta Bailey Family Lecture in Christian Ethics. I want to tell you all, before I introduce our beloved colleague Dean Hibbs to you, I want to tell you all about Bill and Roberta Bailey and their family. The Bailey family is marked by a deep commitment to their faith, to the Waco community, to Baylor University, and to one another. Bill and Roberta Bailey were both Waco natives. They were both graduates of Waco High School. One of the most touching things I know about those two people, and I did know them personally and well, was that they met when Bill was 15 years old and Roberta was 14 years old. And they were married in 1950 and spent almost 64 years together. They were both graduates of Baylor University and accomplished students while they were here. Roberta earned a degree in English and then later a master's degree. Bill earned an undergraduate degree and then a law degree, and then enjoyed a long and distinguished career in the insurance and risk management business. He was a pioneer in that business and an industry leader. They were the consummate servants. Bill served during the Korean conflict in the United States Air Force. They were deeply engaged during all of their years, all their married life and family life, in civic affairs here in Waco. I can't even name all the ways in which they were immersed in the life of this community, but they included leadership with Hillcrest Hospital, the United Way, with Campfire, with Junior League. And they deeply loved their church, First Baptist Church of Waco, both teaching Sunday school there for many years. Roberta was actually a lifelong member. She had a precious story of her father actually bringing her to church the first time. I believe it was on horseback. There wasn't even she didn't come to church the first time she came in a car. She came with her daddy and her mother horseback. They loved their church, they loved their community, and they also loved Baylor University. They were ardent and faithful supporters of academic scholarships and initiatives all across the disciplines. They were supporters of the athletic program. And Bill, seems to me, deserves special gratitude from us even today. He served as a member of the board, both of the Board of Trustees and later as a member of the Board of Regents for a total of 18 years. And during the presidencies of Abner McCall and Herbert Reynolds and Robert Sloan. Roberta died in 2014. Bill died in 2015, and we miss them greatly. And oh, how they loved their family. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren and scores of friends, and 3 extraordinary sons, Roy and Hatch and Wes. And we are deeply grateful, and I hope that you will join me in thanking and expressing gratitude to Wes Bailey, who's here. Wes, will you stand and let us thank you? family really was important to Bill and Roberta Bailey, and they were wonderful, wonderful friends. And when I talked to Bill about the very idea of this lecture series going forward in 2014, we talked about the importance of it being not merely the Bill and Roberta Bailey lecture, but the Bill and Roberta Bailey family lecture. So we have gratitude for the family and look forward to the days ahead. I'd like to introduce now the person who will deliver the 2017 Baylor Lecture in Christian Ethics, our dear colleague Tom Hibbs. Since 2003, Tom Hibbs has been Dean of the Honors College and Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Culture at Baylor University. He received his BA and MA in Philosophy from the University of Dallas and an MMS and a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. He was a tutor at Thomas Aquinas College for 3 years before moving to Boston College, where he taught for 13 years and was professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy. During his time at Baylor University, the Honors College has grown and flourished in remarkable ways, and now includes 4 programs with approximately 1,000 students and 36 full-time faculty members, many of whom are here today. He is also director of the Baylor in Washington, D.C. program, in which capacity he could coordinate student internships, a religious liberty initiative with Georgetown University, and monthly faculty events. In addition to 2 books on film and another co-written with contemporary painter Mako Fujimura, Hibbs has written 3 books on the philosophical and theological work of St. Thomas Aquinas. His most recent work, which is here and available for you, is recently published by Baylor University Press, titled Wagering on an Ironic God, Pascal, on Philosophy and Faith. He's published more than 100 reviews and discussion articles on film, theater, art, higher education. He's called upon regularly to comment on film and popular culture, made more than 100 appearances on radio, including nationally syndicated NPR shows like All Things Considered. He's currently the president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. Dean Hibbs also I wanted to mention about him that his lectures have been protested by nihilists at Boston University and by communists in Palermo, Sicily. I expect no such protests today, but you never know. I know one thing about Tom Hibbs. He's someone who makes Baylor a really interesting place. And in my mind, the most interesting place to be. So we're deeply grateful for him today. Skills, Virtues, and the Christian University, Liberal Learning in a Liberal Time. Please join me in welcoming Tom Hibbs.
I don't know about that last comment. It sounds like the version of the curse, may you live in interesting times, may you have interesting colleagues. I don't know which is worse. I want to thank Wes for being here and for his own support and his family's support of this lectureship. One of the things that I've grown to love about Baylor that I think really is a distinctive feature of Baylor are these family lectures. We have in the Honors College each fall the Drumright Family Lecture. And I don't know many places where, you have lots of places where there are endowed lectures, but I've never been any place where the endowed lectures include in their title the family, the entire, and a sense of the entire family's commitment to Baylor and to events like this. So I'm really grateful to you and your family for making this possible. I do have to apologize that the lectureship seems to have come suddenly upon very hard times. I mean, you had Candace Vogler and Greg Jones, and now you got Hibbs. So I apologize for that, and I'm going to work with Darren to make sure he does better next year. But I'm honored to be here and to deliver this lecture today. I want to say that before I get started, that there's a version of this coming out in Modern Age on skills and virtues and the university. But this, much of my thought here, some of the authors I'll be discussing, I've been reading and teaching for many years, but the particular line of discussion that I'm taking today has arisen out of a multi-year conversation that some of us here at Baylor have had with some friends at the University of Virginia. James Hunter, who is full-time at the University of Virginia, has a visiting appointment here. Chad Wellman in the German department at UVA. Garnett Cadigan, a very famous contemporary essayist. And Darren has been involved in these conversations. Elizabeth Corey, who's here. Richard Russell, Alan Jacobs, and David Jeffrey. And so we've been conversing about the humanities, and skills is one part of that. So I owe a debt of gratitude to those friends and those conversations. I'm not going to pause to identify this as I go through, but I realize that at least in the first half of this talk, almost everybody I refer to, I met at Baylor University through conferences or visiting speakers who came in. So I was noticing that as I was reading this over just a couple days ago. And I begin with one of those people who's visited Baylor. In her best-selling Reading Lolita in Tehran, Azar Nafisi offers a memoir of her time as an underground teacher of young Iranian women with a curriculum consisting of forbidden Western literary texts. In an account that is at once beautiful and deeply moving, Nafisi makes a compelling case for the power of these texts to keep human longing, human thinking alive, and thus to subvert the aspirations of a totalitarian regime. In her more recent book, her latest book, The Republic of Imagination, Nafisi, who's now settled as a professor in America, wonders at what she sees as the indifference of Americans to their own intellectual and literary heritage, an indifference that she fears will endanger the democratic ideal. I'm double mic'd here. Never feel like I should be investigating Russians or something. Where was I? In totalitarian countries, liberal education is a basic need, Nafisi writes, as it enables individuals to reclaim identities always under assault. Those who have suffered censorship, jail, or even torture because they have pursued a serious education have a profound sense of the value of liberal education. But what about ordinary Americans, Nafisi asks? Do they even know what they are missing? How can we, she writes, rekindle the hunger? It is striking how little impact the issues and questions, themes that Nafisi raises concerning liberal education have had on recent defenses of liberal education. In contemporary discussions, the appeal to the role of liberal education in inculcating useful, transferable skills is increasingly prominent. Institutions of higher learning, I dare say even Baylor itself, tout the critical thinking skills of students exposed to the liberal arts. Major national documents on the humanities have come to highlight these skills as well. One of the most recent national reports from the Academy of Arts and Sciences, The Heart of the Matter, published in 2013, uses the term skills, especially critical thinking skills and communication skills, 40 times in the document. Yet nowhere do the following terms appear at all: beauty, virtue, truth, ethics, morality, goodness, religion, justice, or wisdom. Nowhere. One of the depressing features of the dreary committee-written documents like The Heart of the Matter is that they rely so little on the humanities themselves. Indeed, how could you write a document entitled The Heart of the Matter and not be aware of Graham Greene? No one would be inspired to study the humanities after reading such documents. Alongside the surge in instrumentalist, skills-based defenses of liberal education, we have also witnessed in recent years a critique of these accounts and pleas for a recovery of a rich conception of liberal education. I'm going to begin by looking briefly at these two trends, diametrically opposed trends, and then argue that attention to the role of skills in some modern humanistic texts, one from Orwell and one from Frederick Douglass, can help us recover a deeper sense of the role of skills in the liberation of human souls from the conditions of being bound. There are a lot of reasons for the ascendancy of an instrumental, skill-based case for liberal education. There is in modern culture, and especially in American culture, an accent on useful knowledge, a suspicion of mere book learning, and a desire to demonstrate the productivity of whatever arena of activity citizens might devote themselves to. In recent years, both Republicans and Democrats have denigrated liberal education. You may recall Senator Marco Rubio suggesting that young persons would be better off learning the trade of welding than they would be devoting themselves to the study of philosophy. He may have a point there. Meanwhile, as a philosopher with children, Democratic President Barack Obama dismissed the study of art history as a waste of time and money. He quickly backtracked on that. Also, Obama's Department of Education moved steadily in the direction of grading universities on how well their graduates do in finding employment, and demanded, following the lead of Margaret Spellings, George W. Bush's Secretary of Education, that all instruction be validated through measurable student outcomes relevant for the marketplace. This is one area where we have bipartisanship. If you add to these tendencies the elevated costs of higher education, tumescent student loan debt, and a tighter job market, it's not at all surprising that the accent would increasingly fall on the economically productive or instrumental results of education. In such a context, any case for liberal education would naturally bend in the direction of displaying the utility in acquiring skills or job-ready competencies. In recent years, though, the consequences of this lack of vision about the proper ends of higher education has come under fire. Consider, for example, a book by Harry Lewis, a former dean at Harvard, entitled Excellence Without a Soul: How a Great University Forgot Education, a central contention of which is the dismal judgment that the ideal of liberal education lives on in name only. A crucial period, Lewis writes, in the lives of young men and women is being squandered by universities who increasingly treat students as consumers and seek to treat students as consumers oriented to achievement in whatever goals they happen to have. The laissez-faire attitude of students conspires with the libertarian attitudes of research-oriented professors, as Lewis sees it. Both groups are happy to be left alone to pursue personal goals. I'm reminded of a moment, one of those wonderful moments when I was teaching at Boston College, and I was sensing that the students might not be reading as assiduously as they should or as they claimed. And so I gave a pop quiz, and one of the students whom I knew very well in the class said to me, "Come on, Dr. Hibbs, I thought we had an agreement." And I said, "What, you pretend to learn and I pretend to teach?" In a similar vein, Anthony Kronman, former dean of Yale Law School, in his book Education's End, writes that under the influences of misguided conceptions of pluralism and secularism and the pressure of the research ideal, universities have largely given up on the question, what is living for? Kronman argues, on the basis of his experience in the directed studies program at Yale, that a disciplined survey of the answers to the question, what is living for, supplied by great artists, writers, politicians, can be helpful to students in thinking about the purpose of their own lives, and that this is one of the points of liberal education. Related criticisms of higher education can be found in the occasional essays of Andrew Delbanco of Columbia. Delbanco writes regularly for the New York Review of Books on education. He acknowledges and praises the liberalizing trajectory of higher education in the second half of the 20th century that has opened the door for many who were previously shut out because of race, ethnicity, or gender. This liberalizing trajectory has also allowed across the country for the founding of a diverse set of types of institutions, including small religious arts colleges. As in every human story, Delbanco adds, there is loss as well as gain. The loss, as he sees it, concerns the question what students ought to learn once they get to college, or even why they're going at all. In nearly a quarter century of teaching at Harvard and Columbia, Delbanco writes, I have discovered that the question of what undergraduate education should be all about is almost taboo. He goes on to note that the greatest freedom is allotted to those few American students who attend a traditional elite liberal arts college, where intellectual, social, and sexual freedom is assumed to be an inalienable right. Delbanco wonders, though, whether behind the commitment to student freedom is not a certain institutional pusillanimity, a market-based fear of how requirements of any sort, anywhere on campus, might shrink the applicant pool and thus trigger a decline in the university rankings in the U.S. News and World Report. Anticipating many of these observations, David Brooks wrote, now 16 years ago in the Atlantic Monthly, that famous essay, The Organization Kids. That was about Princeton. He's teaching at Yale now and finds that the essay doesn't really need to be updated. He finds much to admire in contemporary students. But these same students, he says, who rarely discuss intellectual matters outside of class, become tongue-tied when it comes to the question, what makes for a virtuous life? In response to the question, what builds character, they cite the honor code forbidding cheating or policies intended to reduce drinking. Indeed, in discussions of ethical matters, they move rapidly in the direction of legislative issues and adopt a legalistic or therapeutic vocabulary. Brooks detects the longing for something more than this in students and more than what universities supply in the way of services and paths to career success. Brooks puts the problem in terms of a question. How do you organize your accumulations so that life does not become just one damn merit badge after another? A series of resume notches without a point. Students, he says, hunger for the solution, but that is the one subject on which the authorities are strangely silent. Although these list of authors I've quoted are united mainly by what they criticize in contemporary universities, the alternatives that they suggest, that Lewis, Kronman, Delbanco, and Brooks suggest, make a case for the enduring significance of liberal learning. The current focus on critical thinking skills is about as remote as one can be from the noble and broad ideals that they think liberal education ought to pursue. The skills acquisition defense tends to instrumentalize all of education, and thus even to ignore the specific content of disciplines of inquiry. And they fail typically to make a direct substantive case for the study of any particular discipline whatsoever. This is particularly bad, I think, in the skills acquisition defense of the humanities, because it's not clear that all or most or sometimes any of the skills mentioned are peculiarly fostered in the humanities, that they couldn't be found in science classes or social science classes. The contemporary way of highlighting skills minimizes, where it attends to it at all, any notion of education as aiming at the formation of character in any deep sense. And this is not surprising. Mere skills float free of any particular content. That is, of course, one of the things that gives them pride of place, the supposition that they are easily transferable from one context to another. Of course, this assumption runs into trouble when skills that work in one area confront the complexity in quite a different arena. Witness our current president, who, like many in corporate world, thinks that his skills are transferable to any and every arena, confronting the issue of national health care and remarking, as he did just a few weeks ago, nobody knew health care could be so complicated. But skills float free not just of particular subject matters, they also float free of the character of the one possessing them. Again, this is part of what makes them attractive. They can allegedly be disengaged from any particular set of ends. By contrast, intellectual virtues, or skills understood as intellectual virtues, are best formed in the mastery of certain types of subject matter, while both intellectual and especially moral virtues form the character of the one possessing them in its intellectual, moral, aesthetic, or religious dimensions in determinate ways. Virtues are connected to specific visions of the goods that they nourish. By contrast, the effort of experts to detach skills from content is really the unrealistic separation of the how from the why. But surely the importance and relevance of this or that skill depends to some extent on some understanding of who each of us is and what we are supposed to do as beings fitted to accept moral responsibility that comes from living with truth. One exception to the rather shallow contemporary treatment of skills can be found in Stanley Fish's book, Save the World on Your Own Time. And the title should be read as a kind of taunt. It's an attack on the practice of professors using the classroom as a field for inculcating political commitments, typically, in Fish's mind, liberal political commitments in their students. Fish thinks that there is, at least in the secular research university, no grounds whatsoever for this vision of education. The danger here, as Fish sees it, is a different kind of instrumentalist account. Not that liberal education will get you a high-paying job, but that, as Fish puts it, what goes on in the liberal arts classroom can only be justified by its extracurricular political payoff. He insists, by contrast, that the chief goal of higher education is the mastery of intellectual and scholarly skills. These skills are gained through the study in depth of specific disciplines or of the connection between disciplines. As he puts it at one point, if you're not in the pursuit of truth business, you shouldn't be in a university. Developing any account of the authentic pursuit of truth, including, of course, indispensable skills for that pursuit, cannot avoid articulating a set of virtues. Here we find Fish defending skills, but not in a reductionist instrumentalist way, and in conjunction with the conception of the intellectual life as ordered to the discovery of truth. The illiberalism of our time has much to do with the crisis of truth that has suddenly dawned upon so many with the advent of Trump, including Time magazine. The relativism that has pervaded so much academic discourse and so much of popular culture for at least a century could hardly result in anything other than the claim that there are alternative facts. That is a direct inference and consequence of relativism. The stridently secular philosopher Bernard Williams took aim in his book, Truth and Truthfulness, at the insouciant relativism found in, as he puts it, the café politics practiced by the secret agents of humanities departments, who revel in undermining any claim to truth and saunter off with the smug nod that registers a deconstructive job neatly done. Williams wants to revive the virtue of truthfulness as central to any liberal education and is especially important for the humanities. He notes the scientists are much more reticent about giving up on the notion of truth than many professors in the humanities are. Williams focuses especially on the virtue of accuracy, what he calls a passion for getting things right. Fish himself cites John Henry Newman, who argued that the aim of a liberal education was a philosophical habit of mind, a habit that enables one to see things in their particularity and to see things whole, and discern relations amongst the parts. The claim that liberal education is about the inculcation of skills and virtues connected to determinate practices suggests a way out of the contemporary malaise concerning skills. Drawing upon the writings of George Orwell and Frederick Douglass, I would like to suggest that on some understandings of skills, they are inseparable from a conception of virtue and human character and the human good. Skills are indeed crucial to any liberal education. That is, to any education that proposes to liberate the human soul from various ways of being bound. In his mid-century essay, Politics in the English Language, Orwell, who knew a thing or two about the way in which modern citizens could become bound, has this to say about our public discourse. The decline of language must ultimately have political and economic causes. It is not simply due to the bad influence of this or that individual writer, but an effect can become a cause, reinforcing the original cause and producing the same effect in an intensified form, and so on indefinitely. A man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure, and then fail all the more completely because he drinks. It is rather the same thing that is happening to the English language. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish. But the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. He's writing this in the middle of the 20th century. Orwell highlights for us the danger of a kind of passivity with respect to our common language, the way in which a certain laziness with language atrophies the mind and paralyzes the soul. The advice he offers to writers applies equally to thinkers and speakers, that is, to citizens. A scrupulous writer, in every sentence he writes, will ask himself at least 4 questions. Thus, what am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clear? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? And he will probably ask himself 2 more. Could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is unavoidably ugly? All you who are writing papers, just take that passage, put it right above, put it on the top of your PC or your Mac to block out my eyeball when it appears. These habits of thinking, speaking, and writing are more than mere rhetorical ornaments or academic niceties. These embody the virtues of inquiry, discovery, and articulation, virtues that in the old days were inculcated in what we used to call the trivium, the arts of discourse, essential to a liberal education. Without developing these habits, Orwell says, we will remain bound, succumbing to the tyranny of cliches and majority opinion. As Orwell says, after describing how we ought to go about thinking and writing and speaking, but you are not obliged to go to all this trouble. You can shirk it by simply throwing your mind open and letting the ready-made phrases come crowding in. They, the ready-made phrases, will construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you to a certain extent. And if needed, they will perform the important service of partially concealing your meaning even from yourself. It is at this point, Orwell concludes rather gently, that the special connection between politics and the debasement of language becomes clear. Orwell's accent on politics and on the good of what we would be tempted to call critical thinking skills in curbing the decline of public language might seem to provide only an instrumental defense, and thus to anticipate rather than transcend the defects of more recent statements. But what he's offering is much more than that. First, there is something more than mere critical thinking operative in what Orwell recommends to us. There is a capacity to appraise arguments, to weigh diction and modes of expression, a facility of language and thought that no mere set of critical thinking skills can guarantee. Second, for Orwell, the political and social payoff is not, or at least not only, the creation of productive workers helping to grow the economy, not in itself an evil. Instead, the vision of politics here presupposes that citizens exercise self-governance, especially in matters of judgment. In a pluralist democracy such as ours, this means that we learn to engage with others, and not just with others who agree with us. We must learn to practice the arts of what our Baylor colleague John Haldane calls reasoned disagreement. And this underscores an important and underappreciated link between specific conceptions of education and politics on the one hand, and visions of citizenship on the other. Implicit, sometimes explicit, in the contemporary emphasis upon skills is a conception of citizenship as forming productive workers. But this is pretty distant from the classical liberal conception of citizenship, still resonant in Orwell's essay. Orwell, happily for him, did not live long enough to see the advent of Twitter, but there's good reason to think that he would be at least as worried about the state of the English language today as he was in the middle of the last century. Indeed, it is striking that many more young persons experience higher education today than at the time of Orwell, and yet our public discourse seems to be none the better for it. Even as universities, partly willingly and partly under the pressures of accrediting agencies and other government agencies to say precisely what they are doing, have devoted themselves more explicitly to the skills acquisition model. At the same time, our public discourse seems to be in serious decline without any deep, hopeful signs of improvement. If you see any, I need to hear them. Now, Frederick Douglass. In his narrative of a life of a slave, Douglass makes a similar sort of case for skills acquisition. Consider, for example, the learning of as basic a skill as reading or vocabulary acquisition. Throughout his book, Douglass turns to the issue of education, access to which is systematically denied to slaves. Douglass was born into slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland, when at a certain point he sold from that location to some folks in Baltimore. He encounters in the mother of the house a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings, who begins teaching him to read. But the husband abruptly terminates his education with the blunt statement, it would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Douglass receives this harsh commentary, and this is a quotation, as a special revelation concerning the white man's power to enslave the black man. Education and slavery, he writes, were incompatible with one another. Despite his master's attempts at foreclosing education, Douglass is both fortunate and resourceful. Occasional free time on the city streets of Baltimore affords him opportunities to engage in spelling competitions with white boys from the neighborhood. So he'd pull out a rock or a piece of chalk and say, hey, I can spell this word, these 5 words, can you spell 5 words? And he would increase his spelling capacity and his vocabulary. By exercising diligence in the pursuit of knowledge, Douglass not only expands his vocabulary, he increases his confidence in his intellectual ability. As he puts it at one point, to properly teach is to induce man's potential and latent greatness, to discover and develop the noblest, highest, and best that is in him, and unfold and strengthen the powers of the human soul. We should notice here the deep connection in Douglass's mind between the mastery of certain basic skills on the one hand and self-knowledge, a sense of one's own dignity, and an enhanced and expanded capacity to interact with others on the other. In this way, skills can be reconnected to the original etymological meaning of liberal education, which literally means to be led forth, or to be led out into freedom. As is the case with many African American authors, Douglass attends not just to the horrors of slavery and prejudice and the incompatibility of either with education, but also to the ways in which the condition of being bound is characteristic in analogous ways and to varying degrees of all human beings. Understood in these terms, liberal education is not an ornament for an aristocratic class, but a necessity for true freedom. In the very opening of his narrative, where Douglass relates what little he knows of his origins, he states that one of the strategies of the masters is to deny slaves the possibility of coming to know who and what they are. Slaves are kept ignorant of their exact dates of birth, often of their parents and siblings. He writes, by far, the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. The white children could tell of their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. Here, a certain kind of education, a negative education, which teaches a disciplined and contented ignorance, undermines the possibility of an education that frees. The deprivation of self-knowledge about one's past, one's sources or roots, cuts off from knowledge where one now stands in the present. Paradoxically, perhaps, the ignorance of the past deprives one of hope for the future. The scope of one's awareness contracts to the mere present. One approaches the condition of animals, the horses, whose capacity for memory and for anticipation of the future is quite limited. As we shall see, Douglass is indicting a peculiar feature of modern slavery, a feature that others will identify as having analogs in modern politics. Douglass's opening observations fit rather nicely with the thesis that modern politics, in its worst forms, can be an instrument of oppression precisely by its tendency to deprive individuals of the possibility of gaining self-knowledge through communal life and inquiry. The absence of such knowledge and the opportunity for pursuing it with others makes an individual more pliable, docile to the forces that would control him or her. Here Douglass anticipates Orwell. By now it should be clear that Douglass's conception of education, even when he's talking about reading and spelling, involves much more than the mere acquisition of technical skills. It provides him, as he spells out further in his book, with an opportunity to inquire with others about the good, to deliberate about the just and the unjust, the natural and the unnatural, as Aristotle describes the goal of politics in the opening of his Politics. Above all, Douglass notes, masters forbid slaves to speak together about weighty matters. Another insidious practice of slavery is the allowance of false freedom. On holidays, Douglass relates, slaves are free to indulge in every kind of unrestrained behavior involving alcohol, sex, and violence. Having been immersed in such disorder, the slaves are more than happy to be rescued by the order provided by slavery. Better to let them indulge in drunken orgies on holidays, thereby reinforcing the notion that they are not intellectual, moral, and accountable, Douglass writes. He detects a cynical strategy. The holidays are part and parcel of the gross fraud, wrong, and inhumanity of slavery. When the slave asks for virtuous freedom, the cunning slaveholder, knowing his ignorance, cheats him with a dose of vicious dissipation, artfully labeled with the name of liberty. In Douglass's narrative, slaveholders do everything in their power, in the name of the gospel very often, to destroy a Sabbath school in which Douglass studies Scripture with fellow slaves. It's a beautiful passage. I had at one time, Douglass writes, over 40 scholars, and those of the right sort, ardently desiring to learn. They were of all ages. These were great days to my soul. The work of instructing my dear fellow slaves was the sweetest engagement with which I was ever blessed. He describes this society of fellow slaves as noble, brave souls who were linked and interlinked with each other. Douglass's fellow inquirers constitute a community, a kind of school, jointly sharing and recognizing the goods of knowledge and the goods of friendship. One would be hard-pressed to find a better description of a community of teachers and students. But his account also reminds us that certain kinds of tyranny are most opposed to certain kinds of human friendship. Ties formed in the recognition and pursuit of goods independent of and perhaps hostile to the dominant political order. An order that is too often content with an indifferent, ignorant, and disconnected populace, or a populace connected only through Facebook and Twitter. Here, the simple skill of reading enables individuals to participate in an enhanced and expanded communal life, one grounded in the shared reading of books that can inform a vision of the good life. As Tocqueville observed in anticipation of Douglass, a defining feature of slavery in the modern American South, and in striking contrast to slavery as practiced in the ancient world, is the refusal on pain of grave penalty to allow slaves to be taught to read and write. The most insidious thing about modern slavery is it takes direct aim at the intellect and will of those who are enslaved. Douglass writes, "To make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken the moral and mental vision and as far as possible to annihilate the power of reason. The slave must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man." The implication, I think, for a liberal education is that without a felt need, an awareness of a lack or an absence, true education can have no purchase on an individual soul. Furthermore, for Douglass, the realization of our humanity is not a given. It depends in some measure on forces external to us and the active development of powers internal to us. The longing for education may be most deeply felt by those at the margins of modern society, who experience most dramatically the gap between possibility and reality. A black preacher at the time of Douglass observed, "The ignorant whites had every opportunity to learn, but didn't. We had every chance to remain ignorant, and many of us learned in spite of that." Douglass anticipates, largely because he influences, the 20th century author W.E.B. Du Bois, whose chapter on liberal education in the souls of black folk might well be the best thing ever written on liberal education by an American. The goal of education, Du Bois writes, and you can find this across campus in this cement, is not to earn meat, but to know the aim and end of that life which meat nourishes. Du Bois presents us with an exalted notion of education, but it's important to see that he's not indifferent to pragmatic needs. The goal of education, he insists, is not merely to inspire human hearts with a vision of the true, the good, and the beautiful, without pointing out the practical way of realizing some of these dreams here and now in the lives of students. Education, he says, must balance ideals with the greater need of specialization and technique. In his essay, Du Bois appeals to both, at a crucial point, he appeals to both Socrates and St. Francis of Assisi. Although he does not expand on Francis's way of life in souls, he does elsewhere, and I'm going to end with this. You wondered when I was going to get to something Christian. In a commencement address Du Bois delivered at a public school in Washington, D.C. in 1907, not long after a devastating earthquake leveled San Francisco. Du Bois uses that as an occasion for considering St. Francis as a model of civilization. Can you imagine somebody doing that today? In so doing, he illustrates what he thinks the young need by way of education. Why, Du Bois asks, should we ponder the life of a medieval saint? Why go so far back in time to understand where we are today? He responds, by fixing in our memories the life of Francis, we will come to appreciate a certain attitude toward wealth and distinction, and of the need and place of human training to emphasize this attitude. What was Francis's attitude, according to Du Bois? Francis understood that there were material and bodily needs, and that satisfying these needs was a great good, indeed an indispensable good. But according to Du Bois, Francis was also convinced that there were greater wants for human service and sympathy, for knowledge and inspiration, for hope and truth and beauty. And Francis understood the tension between the great and the greater wants. To satisfy spiritual starvation may well require some degree of renunciation of material goods. Education certainly involves the cultivation of a sense of the relative importance and necessity of these different wants and goods. But education is principally about what Francis's life was about. Du Bois says Francis sought to read life's riddle and tell the world its true unraveling. He faced the same condition we face. He posed the questions each of us must ask. What am I? What is this world about me? And the world and I? How shall we work and laugh together? Francis's life is a response to the deepest and most enduring questions of the human soul. Du Bois writes, and this is a bit of a long quote, the lesson of St. Francis is not the renunciation of wealth and the deification of poverty. It is, on the contrary, simply this great truth. The work of the world is to satisfy the world's wants. Now, the world wants material wealth, such as good food and clothing and shelter. But this is not all, nor even the greater part of its need. It wants human service and sympathy, knowledge and inspiration. And so great are these greater wants that often their satisfaction demands, in some St. Francis of Assisi, an utter renunciation of much of the material good of the world, that its spiritual starvation may be satisfied. Now, in turning rather rapidly, as I have here at the end, from the earlier discussion of skills and virtues to this much more robust vision of an education, with its emphasis on truth and beauty and hope, we have not left skills behind, at least not as skills are understood by Orwell or Douglass. What was instructive about their accounts is the way the inculcation of basic skills is connected, at least implicitly, to the formation of of souls in the greater appreciation of the true and the beautiful. Certainly any Christian account of liberal education would want some sort of robust vision at its foundation and as an integral part of its articulation of the goods of education. It's striking that in response to this cataclysmic event, the San Francisco earthquake, Du Bois turns to the past. He does not focus on the technological resources of modernity, the way in which better building codes, forecasting, or improved construction might enable us in the future to mitigate the destruction, although he certainly would be in favor of those things. But he looks not so much to a future in which such tragedy would no longer exist. Such events will come. The question is what we can learn from them to make the lives we are leading here and now more fully human. For this, he looks to an exemplary human life, in this case, an exemplary religious life. Now, Du Bois, it is true, does not focus so much on the specifically theological elements in Francis's life. To get a fuller sense of Francis's vision, which was part, I would argue, of what we might justly call both a 13th century Renaissance and a 13th century Reformation, we would need to attend more carefully than Du Bois does to Francis's devotions, both to poverty and to the Eucharist, both to the preaching of the gospel and to the regular meditation on Christ's passion. But Du Bois, speaking on his behalf, comes closer than a lot of modern celebrations of Francis's life to the core of that life. These modern celebrations tend to depict Francis as a great lover of nature and nothing more, and at its worst in the 60s as a kind of flower child or stoner naturalist. Du Bois's Francis is closer to the saint who actually transformed Western Christianity in the 13th century. Where there is a tension, it's between the vision of human education that Du Bois finds in Francis and the parochial, skills-based, merely instrumentalist account that has become dominant in our public discourse and even in many of our universities. Indeed, Du Bois is putting into question the very ends that are operative, often without argument, and typically even without conscious awareness in our public discourse. A commitment to this richer conception of liberal education ought to be one of the central commitments of faith-based institutions of higher learning. The location of such religious institutions, the location that such religious institutions will occupy in the panoply of higher education, will vary over time with respect to the dominant educational institutions of any age. And sometimes religious institutions will be closer to the mainstream, the middle, the elite. At other times, they'll be more distant. But liberal education often flourishes at the margins, as is evident from the examples of a group of young women reading Nabokov in Tehran, or a cohort of slaves reading scripture on the eastern shore of Maryland. In our own time, Dostoevsky and Shakespeare have been read with great passion behind prison walls, while a club of young immigrants in San Francisco spent every Saturday of their high school time reading Dante's Divine Comedy with great profit. We need, with Du Bois, Orwell, Nafisi, and others, to pause and listen to stories and learn the life lessons they contain. Turning, at least with some regularity, although certainly not exclusively, to the past is a way of reminding us what we might be missing in the present. Is it any surprise that the demise of the appreciation of liberal education in our time coincides with historical amnesia in our public life? Indeed, very often, even in our institutions of higher education. We have lost, as Nafisi wants us to understand, we have lost or are in danger of losing the capacity to name what is missing or what we need. The first task of any serious education is not to assemble the widest possible buffet of offerings, but to determine what is lacking, what is missing, what is most needful in the souls of young people. Thank you.
Do you want to suggest any pivotal texts that you think are sort of be at the core of awakening the hunger and of feeding the soul?
I think you can pick, and I think the various canons are full of texts that, I mean, almost any great work of literature is going to have depictions of characters who suffer deprivation and experiencing longing, and that will in some measure be for something like what liberal education offers in that full sense that I was hinting at from Du Bois and Francis at the end. You saw what I was doing here. I mean, my own strategy increasingly with this is to pick texts, although I talked about reading old texts. Well, what is an old text? Is it anything that wasn't printed 15 minutes ago? I don't know what an old text is nowadays. It's hard because our cultural, our attention span is so short with these things. But I talked about really old texts, but even recent texts, and even more, these recent texts that speak to us in a language that resonates with our current human condition. I don't want to say that the Odyssey and Dante don't resonate with that, but I think it sometimes takes more of an effort on students' part, first-time readers, to see how it speaks directly or indirectly to our condition. And if you want to awaken the longing, better for that to happen early rather than late, right? And so one of the things, when I was at Boston College, I used to teach a number of courses chronologically backward, which had the interesting effect, since students always think that the last thing you read is the most recent and the most truthful. They all went out thinking Plato was a great contemporary philosopher. And I'm willing to live with that. But one of the reasons I did that was it seemed to me that certain late 19th and 20th century authors actually raise questions in a way that if you're doing it in a chronological sequence, students suddenly get worked up when they read Nietzsche, or if they read some of the Orwell or something like that, in ways that engages them, but then you're at the end of the course. So with an ethics class, I started teaching it backwards precisely because I wanted them worked up. I wanted their doubts to be on the table, wanted their questions to be on the table at the beginning. And then we worked our way back to Plato from reading Nietzsche at the outset. So I think any great text is going to feed this hunger, is going to give students ways of seeing that the soul has these hungers. How quickly it reaches our students, I'm not sure about. I mean, some students reach that way pretty quickly, others not so fast. And so one of the things I've done is to start with authors like Nietzsche, or even not so much Freud, but I have used Freud a little bit, and then authors like the ones I was quoting today, who talk explicitly about the dangers of the loss of this hunger in modern social and political conditions. Yeah, the two classicists over here behind. I scratched all the Virgil stuff from the talk.
So, you've been speaking a lot about students and awakening the hunger in students, and I applaud somewhat everything you've said, and I agree with it. It seems that one of the sort of missing links in this is though the ones who are actually making decisions about education are the parents. And they're the ones. And the students, listen, I want to go to college so I can
Study Latin.
I need to get a good job. They want to go to college.
Yeah.
Well, various reasons, but their parents are the ones who are really saying, well, what is my student going to be able to do with it? How is there any way to educate parents who themselves haven't necessarily?
Well, this is one reason why we have the Coreys speaking to parents groups every time we have a recruitment event, to try and educate the parents. And the other thing I'd say about this is that, I think what Du Bois says is right, that somewhere, somehow, a liberal education has to not just give inspiring ideals, but some way of living this out in the here and now. For students, some way of realizing it in the here and now. So I mean, one of the things I think we've tried to do at Baylor, particularly in the Honors College with our undergraduates, many of whom are pre-med students, send them to Bill Nielsen, and he tells them they ought to read Homer and Plato and Aristotle, because they won't believe me, but they'll believe Dr. Nielsen when he tells them to do that. But what Dr. Nielsen, what Dr. Lisa Baker, what Dr. Troy Abel are doing, and many others across Baylor University, what they're doing with students who have very rigorous pre-professional goals in mind while they're here is helping them to make kind of concrete connections between what they're doing in a humanities class or an economics class, depending upon what they're studying, and their very practical goals that they have for medical school, law school, graduate school, whatever, professional school, whatever it might be. I think that's important, and it's a delicate balance, right? Because there is an instrumental element. I don't think instrumentalizing goods, unless it's God, is necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, Aristotle talks in the beginning of the ethics about goods that are simply desired for their own sake, other goods that are merely instrumental, and then goods that have this peculiar function of being both and. They're both desirable in their own sake and because they contribute to other goods. Well, I want our students, especially early on, because it is a kind of wasted 4 years unless you really do enjoy what you're learning. I mean, why do something for 4 years at the age of 18? If you're our age, then you got to do all sorts of stuff that you don't enjoy. But why any 17 or 18-year-old would choose to do something for the next 4 years that they don't enjoy is just beyond me. Maybe because their parents are saying, you got to do this. That's part of it. But you ought to find a way to love at least some of what you're studying. Not all of it, but some of it. And yet, at the same time, you ought over time to see, this actually does help certain kinds of... Now, it's going to make you perhaps at a certain point think, I don't want to do medicine because I don't want to have to deal with this, or I don't want to practice law, or I don't want to go to Washington and become a politician, or whatever it might be. There might be things that you realize in the course of your education that positively block you from a practical path because of the kind of self-knowledge that you'll have. That can be extremely painful. We can't rule that out, and we can't tell parents that we're going to rule that out. We can't guarantee them that even if they get all A's, when we're done with them, they're necessarily going to want to do exactly what they came here to do. And if they do, then we failed in some measure. Because at a minimum, they ought to think about what they're going to do in a much deeper, much more reflective way, even if they go on to do exactly what they planned to do. But I do think that, and that's why when I give recruitment talks to parents, I talk about a kind of both and. But I say many of the things I've said here today about that this is a time to really enjoy and love learning. And, you know, parents do, most parents, right, most of the time have some concern that their kids are happy. You can consult my children later on whether they think any of the time I have that in mind. But there is an appeal to parents, and there's also an appeal in this, which I've come to use, although I think admissions sometimes trembles and wants to forbid me to speak in front of large groups of parents. But I joke that give us lots of money and we'll prepare your children to fail. Not the best pitch, right? Not the best pitch. People in Jen Karen gets very nervous if I say these kinds of things. So we want to prepare you for success, but they all know that success brings with it certain kinds of frustration, certain kinds, sometimes misery, and failure. Baylor ought to be a place where you've got resources, at least, that you can draw upon when you experience tragedy, when you experience failure, when you experience misery, and especially when those things come from your greatest success, and they will, to some extent. We ought to be a place that's honest about that. And in addition to preparing you to be successful, we ought to prepare you for tragedy, failure, and misery, or at least so that you have something to draw upon. Dr. Smith.
A little bit different question. I was recently having dinner with a pastor who was a good bit older, just retired. He was in his mid-80s, and I asked him about the world that we live in today, what he thought of this from his vantage point as a retired pastor, whether the world we discouraged. I was expecting him to say, we live in this world of extremes now, where, you know, you have this, there's no room for politicians, and some politicians, maybe people in high office, use Twitter accounts to express their ideas rather than speeches. But instead,
You need to get one of those.
Excuse me? Yeah.
You need to get a Twitter account.
But what he instead said was he was actually really encouraged. And he was encouraged because he thought that the brilliance of the gospel message would shine forth more clearly in this environment than the previous. Now, I wonder if we map that paradigm onto your comments about education and about virtues, ethics, and so forth. If we couldn't come to a similar conclusion, provided that we don't lose what we're trying to do here today, right? Provided that we stay on task on the course that we've been on, which is holding students to high standards, having a solid core education for our students. I just wonder if you could maybe comment on that, or what your thoughts are. Now you're the old pastor. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm an old pastor. I'm old. I think part of it is that what Del Banco says about institutions developing a kind of pusillanimity about education, a kind of small-mindedness that doesn't really challenge or raise students' aspirations for what, the danger with the consumer model is that the consumer model, and I like to tell my students that, if I let them out early or you cancel a class, they all cheer. And you're like, well, go pull out a calculator and figure out how much money you or maybe your parents just lost in this one class being canceled. And maybe what we ought to do is you guys just write us a check for $200,000 and we send you a certificate. Is that what you want? I think parents and students need to actually be tougher consumers. They need to be saying, I should be getting something for my money, something substantive. And then what that substantive thing is a matter of conversation. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing is this business that Nafisi's talking about that I return to at the end, and that Douglass is hinting at very profoundly, I think, not just about slavery, but about lots of different social conditions, slavery being the most extreme instance of it, is that our souls can be deadened, that we can lose a sense of what's been lost, if that's not too paradoxical, right? There's this great line from King Lear, this is not the worst so long as we can say this is the worst. Think about that for a minute. It's not going to make you very happy as you think about it. But what's the worst? Being in the worst circumstances and not being able to know that you're in the worst circumstance, right? So I think that capacity is not guaranteed. That capacity to realize that there are things we are in need of, and that the biggest danger is that we could lose, not that we would not get those things, but that we would lose the sense of how significant those things are. If you have that sense, you can have tragedy, which is noble. If you don't have that sense, then you just got a kind of airhead comedy. I don't know. But yes, in the back, Dr. Moore.
Dean Hibbs, thank you very much. A couple of times you mentioned the money and parents, and I fear that increasingly one of the chief impediments to our being able to offer a vigorous vision of liberal education is the fact that we are charging $250,000.
Yep.
And they're scared to death. And the pusillanimity in large measure is a result of not being able to afford the luxury of looking for a liberal education because they've got to pay off these outrageous bills that we're charging them
Yep.
for this. Aren't we undermining the very possibility of liberal education by the ways in which we're going about doing it?
Yeah.
And can you tie that to your emphasis?
At least that's the big risk. Say that, Bill.
Tie that to your emphasis on the significant learning taking place on the margins that you
Well, the big secret is you don't need a university to get an education. Anywhere there are hungry souls and good material to read or to think about, and at least somebody who's a little further along than the rest of the group, some kind of teacher, you can get an education. Can't get a whole education, but you can get the core of an education that someone going to Harvard or Yale or even Baylor might miss. So that's where I think that parents need to be better consumers. They need to really be thinking, and I don't blame them for thinking about both the things that Du Bois talks about. This is what they should be thinking about, ideals and the greater needs of specialization and technique, as Du Bois puts it. Both of those things together. And a university is a place where we ought to be able to do both of those things. We're big enough, we're complex enough. Students use summers rightly, but again, if they have to just work jobs that aren't going to help them advance in any way just to have enough money to pay the bill, it's a problem. I mean, I think it's a huge problem that over the past 50 years, the debt has grown. And it is a problem for liberal, it puts liberal education in a really bad spot, I think. And so you, as I said at the beginning, it's only natural that something like the heart of the matter would not talk about virtue, happiness, beauty, truth, but would use skills 40-some times. Right? That's the natural trajectory of all of the circumstances of higher education right now. And I don't have a quick, yep.
I'm wondering about the extent that you think the debate about the role of skills in education, as you laid out how the sort of typical attack on liberal arts education is that you don't need that, you just need the skills, and the rejoinder is, well, this teaches you certain kinds of skills that, as you point out, you might be able to get through other ways.
Right.
But it seems to me like in the history of education, nobody that I know of who's a proponent of liberal education has argued that education isn't at least partly about teaching skills, whether it's memories, whatever.
Yep.
Right? Or rhetoric. Or
Yep. Indispensable.
Isn't it really, or I'd like to ask you to comment on whether or not, it seems to me, it's really a question of teleology. The question is really, what are the skills for? Right? That's ultimately the question. It's not about whether education is
Yeah. And
concerned with teaching skills.
no, that's absolutely right. And that was part of what I was trying to do with Orwell and Douglass, is to show that here you have very specific accounts of skills, which could be, particularly in the case of Orwell, it's much more eloquent than what you find in typical defenses of critical thinking skills. But you could say all that sort of falls into what Orwell's talking about, critical thinking skills. And yet, for Orwell and for Douglass, these skills are connected to bigger things. So it's the account of skills, not skills, that's the problem. So that in both cases, they're connected to virtues, they're connected to self-knowledge, they're connected to opening up our vision of humanity and our possibility of interacting with others and of becoming people who can learn on our own rather than being beholden to others in a kind of subordinate way.
Please join me again. Thank God.